Hello everyone, welcome back to my devlog, the series where I build a 1 versus 1 tower defense game from scratch using C++. In this episode, we're going to take a look at how I got these visuals in the game. In particular, looking at how the rendering works from a technical perspective, then how I went about actually creating the scene, and then finally, some of the implications of using this approach, because there are definitely some drawbacks to it. Alright, let's get started. Okay, so as you may have guessed, pretty much everything in this scene is rendered with ray tracing. And it's all pre-rendered, which may seem like cheating or something like that, but at the end of the day, the goal is to give a good experience to the user, and they usually don't care too much how it's done. So first, I should just explain what you're even looking at here. So this building is one of the towers in the tower defense game, so if I just jump in, you can see that the end game is a bit less polished than the menu, but you basically build these towers which load up these projectiles from that tube in the center and then fling it off to their enemies. So this chap here is one of these fellas. Okay, so this scene is rendered with just a few textures, so if I bring them up now, these are all the textures that are used in rendering this menu scene. So first up, I'll just do a quick run through of how it all fits together, and then I'll go into a bit more detail on each of those textures, more precisely how they're used, and then also how they are created in the first place. So we strip it all back. So we start with the back of the scene. We add that projectile and the little beams that hold it. We do the front of the scene, and then we do the water. And then after that we do the HUD, but it doesn't really matter for this. Okay, so these first three parts, so the back, the projectile, and the front. So that comes from these two textures here, and a bit from this, but we'll get to that later. So these two here. So the reason it's split up like this is just for getting the projectile obscured by certain parts of the tower model and not obscured by other parts. So as you can see, this beam holder is obscured by this part of the model. And then also when the projectile is loading up during the initial animation, so if I load into the game again, buttons around here somewhere, I come out, you can see it starts off down below and then shoots up. So during that transition, we want to make sure it's obscured by this part, the front of the model, and not by the back. And so this is achieved by basically just creating a plane which slices through the whole scene. So I find a point that's in the middle of this opening here, and then have a normal facing from that point directly towards the camera, and that defines our plane. So we just chop everything in half, and so we render the scene with our ray tracer twice basically, with the back of the scene being able to be directly hit, and the front of the scene can only be hit after the ray has already hit something else. So all the reflections are still correct and everything, but these front pixels won't be showing. And then everything else, if it misses completely, or it doesn't hit the back part of the scene I should say, it just becomes a transparent pixel. And then to get this front texture, I do the same thing but the other way around. So the front slice of the scene can be hit directly, and then the rest of the scene can be hit indirectly to get all the reflections right. And so I also played around with another strategy, which was to output a depth map from the pre-renderer and use that to decide which pixels go in front, which pixels go behind the projectile at runtime. But I quickly realized that was a bit misguided, just because each pixel has some color information from the, pixels along the edge here. Due to multi-sampling, we'll have some color information from in front of where the projectile goes and some from behind. So we open up one of these textures, so we go to this and we zoom in a lot. You can see that along the edge here, we've got these partially transparent pixels. So this allows it, when the whole scene is put together, to either be blended with the back of the tower or the projectile if it happens to be moving through that place. Not sure about that pixel, that's gonna annoy me. Anyway, so that's that part, that's how that fits together. So in terms of the projectile itself and these little beams that hold it up, that's all done at runtime. So the pre-renderer outputs a transformation matrix to tell us sort of the necessary information about the camera position and all that, so that we can convert the world position of this projectile and the holders into the viewport, the clip coordinates. So each of these components, so the projectile itself and each of the beams, are just quads which are billboarded towards the camera, and then there's a fragment shader for the visual effect. Okay, so the next part is the water. This purpley sci-fi water. And so that uses these last two textures here, and also a bit of this one, which I still haven't explained yet, but in due time. The water is fairly standard, really. It uses these two textures, which we already rendered for determining the refraction. So we got that wavy stuff underneath. And then this texture here is the reflection, which is actually not too much of. And then this normal map here, this final texture, is how it gets all those waves. So it uses this normal texture and it's overlaid with itself many times at different scales and positions and moving at different speeds. And that's how I get this ripple effect. So that it changes the normal on the surface of the water, so how it hits basically how it samples from this reflection texture, and also how it samples from the surface underneath. So if I turn off that, you can see the projectile is not quite right, but when it's all put together it looks okay. And I add the normals, it has this kind of effect. And so like I said before, it's not really doing anything too different from what sort of standard water rendering does. And there's actually a pretty good YouTube tutorial series by Thin Matrix, which I will link in the description, that explains how this stuff works. Okay, so finally, this mysterious texture, which I've talked about a bit, but never explained. So each color channel from this image, so the red, the green, and the blue channels, each represent different lighting information for the scene per pixel. So first of all, I'll just break this down into the components. So you can see in the bottom right here that we've just split out the red, the green, and the blue channel into separate layers. So we just look at the red channel for now, and I'll make that a bit easier to see. This is basically how we account for the illumination caused by the projectile in the scene. So the projectile is a light source, it's just a sphere that emits light. And this is created by basically taking the scene with just the ambient light. So there's only two light sources in the whole scene. The ambient light, which like the sun, if you want to think about it, and then the projectile. So those slices of the scene we saw before, the back and the front, so these two here, those are just rendered with only the ambient light. And then we render it once more with just the projectile, and you can kind of think of this red channel as a bit of like a delta between those two renders, and then we just encode it in that color channel, so that on runtime we can add that illumination kind of dynamically. So we go back into the game, so I can turn it off and on, and so you can see like on the face back here, when it's turned on, it adds illumination to the front of the face, but the sort of back behind the nose, where the light from the projectile doesn't reach, you get a bit of a shadow. And you can do this sort of gradually, so you can see at the start it's not there, and then we load it up, it gradually adds that illumination. So you can see it fade in. So yeah, that's basically the point of that red channel. So the green is a lot simpler. So that is simply just the ambient light on the water surface. And the blue channel, which is also quite hard to see. Whoops, it's probably a bit extreme. So the blue channel is the illumination from the projectile on the water surface. So that allows for, so we have like the specular highlights or the reflection of the projectile. We can kind of mask it by that layer there, and you also have the illumination. It's a bit more subtle than the rest of the scene, but you can see it lights up certain parts of the water more than the rest. So this part over here, which is kind of obscured by this corner of the tower, gets less illumination than out here. And you might be thinking that like the information density of some of these textures are pretty low, and that's very true. So like the vast majority of the pixels in this texture are just black, and then pretty much all of these are the same color, and then you only have the interesting information along the edge there. So this could definitely be like a lot more optimized than it is currently. In fact, you could probably say similar for these textures here as well. Like there's a lot of wasted pixels there, but it's kind of good enough for now. And another kind of oddity, I guess, is the fact that, you know, when we're loading up that projectile, we're just fading in this illumination for its final position as opposed to actually scaling it up. But I think in practice it works out fine. So yeah, that's about it for how we piece it all together from a technical perspective. Now we're going to look about how I actually created the scene in the first place. So the goal with this scene was to really blow people away. Like it wasn't enough just for it to be good, it really has to be amazing. And I don't think I've gotten there yet, but I feel like I'm making good progress. Now these high expectations, unfortunately, like I've got basically no background in environment art or even in any of the tools that you would use. So it's been quite a learning process, frustrating at times, but after getting over those initial hurdles, it's become pretty fun. And I also wanted the background scene to better match the theme for the game, which is going to be set on an alien planet ravaged by war with the ruins of the ancient civilization around the place. So I used Blender to build the scene and exporting it to OBJ as input to my ray tracer. So I started out by replacing the ground texture with something a bit more thematically appropriate, and I also added a rock and some water to the scene to make it a bit more interesting and also to test out my workflow from Blender into the game. So I got the textures from 3dtextures.me and the rocks from OpenGL. Now I was pretty happy with the improvement from these very small changes, but there was clearly still a lot of work to do. The first thing I tried to tackle was the cliff face. This really stuck out to me as a really low quality part of the scene. Like it's very jagged and didn't look natural at all. So my first attempt was to use Blender's sculpting tools. I'd never used these before, but I knew they existed, so I just started using them and I just wanted to see what would happen. And the result was I ended up basically just butchering it and causing Blender to hang when I tried to subdivide the mesh too much. My lack of familiarity with the tools was really biting me here, and I was getting a little frustrated at this point. I tried a few other things and it wasn't really working very well, and ended up resorting to a very tedious method, but I knew it would work. And that was just manually moving the vertices into position, trying to create a somewhat smooth face. This still didn't look great, but it was good enough, and I kind of wanted to do something else at this point, so I turned my attention to the rest of the scene. So I started out by chucking a few more rocks in there. It seemed weird to just have one random rock by itself, and this is also where I started to add some more of those lore elements. This is a desolate alien planet ravaged by war. And my current vision for the previous inhabitants of the planet is a rather arrogant and vain civilization. And having giant statues of yourself seems pretty vain, so I figured a shattered statue in the background would fit pretty well. And I spent a long time looking quite specifically for that, like a destroyed statue that wasn't obviously from Earth. And also at this stage, I was only looking for free assets, so like this didn't go too well as you might expect, like it's looking for quite a specific thing. I found lots of destroyed statues from like ancient human civilizations, like Egyptians and stuff like that. And I briefly played with the idea of like leading into this and just using Egyptian statues and saying Egyptians are aliens or whatever. But I moved away from that pretty quickly. So I decided to change strategy there and just go for a model which wasn't already destroyed and then shatter it myself. And that's where I found this angel-like character, which is very high quality, and it was free, which is amazing. And I needed to find a way to destroy this myself. And I really wanted to have the rubble from the model be somewhat realistically broken up and scattered around the scene. So I spent a bit of time looking for physics simulators which could do this for me. I was hoping I could find something where I could just give it a mesh and say it's made of concrete, and then smash it with a wrecking ball or drop it from something. Now I couldn't find anything that did exactly that. Usually you had to fracture the model yourself before running the physics simulation, and some of the tools I just couldn't get to work at all. So my patience ran out and I just started deleting vertices from the original model, just breaking it up myself. And I decided that just having the arm and the head in the scene was enough to kind of get the point across. For all that extra debris there, I just took a cube and used cell fracturing to break it up, and then used Blender's physics engine to just drop it onto the scene from above and let it scatter around the place. I'm still not too happy with this. It doesn't quite seem natural, and like it's weird that the face of the model has all this fine detail in the hair, yet it's meant to be like this destroyed statue, so it doesn't really make sense. And it's definitely something I'm gonna have to come back to later on. I also quickly whipped up this fog effect that you can see. It's not physically correct at all. It just blends to the grey fog color based on the distance to the first thing you hit. Like ideally you would have this probabilistic scatter based on the distance traveled, but this is good enough for now. And I also added these impact craters to add to the feel of a war-torn environment. I whipped these up fairly quickly just using a displacement map. At this point, I was happy with the progress, but I could tell this wasn't going to end up with the result I wanted. I wasn't going to get enough detail and polish, so I needed to rethink things a bit. So I started searching for other places to get assets. Up to this point, I was being a bit of a miser. I was really averse to spending money on any assets if I wasn't certain that I'd end up in the game. But I realized this was costing me too much time fumbling around. Now initially I was just looking for places to get textures. So the textures available from 3dtextures.me are very good, but I wasn't always able to find ones that fit the use case that I had. So I quickly stumbled upon Quixel Megascans. I had heard of it before, but I never really dug into it, and I had a poke around and it looked pretty good. So I was only originally looking for textures, but the 3D assets were pretty tempting too. And I was really interested in some of these plants I saw. I figured I could have some of them under the water and maybe tweak them a little bit to make them look a bit more alien. And the fact that it was really high detail really excited me. You know, it matches well with the aesthetic I'm going for, and the performance wasn't really too much of a concern for me. And the price seemed like it would be worth it for the time it would save me, so I decided to give it a go. And I was immediately disappointed. So the plant mesh wasn't quite the high detail mesh that I thought it was going to be. I set it all to the highest level of detail and even ticked the box for the source model. But it turns out it's just kind of like a few planes with textures stamped onto it, which is great for a lot of context, but wasn't quite what I was looking for. But I got over that and I started looking at the other assets like the cliff faces and the rock formations, and they look really good. And so I started using those and just chucking them on my scene, and that was a lot of fun. It was great being creative and just putting all the pieces together. Much more fun than like stumbling around trying to sculpt things or whatever. I also watched a video from Quixel about how they made one of their cinematic scenes, and that really helped a lot. It pointed out a lot of things that I wasn't even really considering before. And at this point, I started going a bit overboard with the detail. It's all pre-rendered, performance doesn't matter. And so I was using really high detail meshes and 8K textures for everything. And a lot of the tools just couldn't handle that. Like Blender would hang for a very long time when I'm just trying to select vertices, and when I tried to run my ray tracer, the GPU ran out of memory, and I was like, okay, this is not working. So I started being a bit more tactical. So now only the meshes that are close to the camera have high detail, and with the sand in particular, I scaled the number of divisions based on how close it was to the camera, and also adding extra subdivisions when the sand met some other surfaces and it was really obvious that it didn't have enough detail. So after a lot of trial and error and lots of tweaking, I eventually ended up with something I'm reasonably happy with. There's still lots more to do with the scene. I really want to make the fog more dynamic and improve this area where the water meets the cliff face that doesn't seem quite right at the moment. And I still want a higher level of detail on that cliff face, so I might need to sort of scale things around a bit. But it's good enough that I can start having people play it and they can have an experience which lines up pretty well with what I'm going for. Okay, so what are some of the implications of using this approach? So I'm planning to use this in the game as well, so it's not just for the menu scene. So the first is that animation or anything that moves at all is pretty problematic. Like even just that projectile in the menu scene that just starts below the tower and then loads up, even that was causing a lot of problems, and that was fairly simple, right? Like I had to cut my scene in half, and I had to have this separate render to dynamically change the illumination caused by that projectile. So that's definitely a drawback to this. And there are other workarounds you can do, like in some cases you could like render to a video and kind of like decode that at runtime, things like that. But yeah, it's much more annoying than if you weren't doing this pre-rendered approach. So one of the areas this is going to cause me problems is with the attackers. So they move through the scene, right? It's not like you can pre-render every possible angle you see them from. And I do have some plans for how to address this, but I'll make another video about that once I've gotten there. So another drawback, which is quite related, is the constraints it places on the camera, how you view the scene. So if you're using like a perspective projection like I am, you can't really move the camera at all. And finally, like once you start going down this route of pre-rendering with ray tracing, you kind of painted yourself into a corner. Like everything has to be high detail, including the things that aren't ray traced. Like all the visual effects has to be really on point, and the water, things like that. And also the inconsistencies are very noticeable. So I spent a decent amount of time just trying to match the color tones between those different assets I got from Quixel, making sure they matched the sand properly, there were no discontinuities, things like that. And so I've been finding that has actually been taking up quite a bit of time for me, just getting all that to match up nicely. So like listing out all these drawbacks, it might seem like it's not really worth it or something, but I think it is actually a very good approach to take for this game. Like these drawbacks aren't too bad. Like have some towers, they don't necessarily animate as much as like a 3D character would or something like that. And I don't really need to move the camera. You can see the whole game from a single perspective, so that's fine. And like the performance is really good, right? Like computationally, the runtime is basically just a glorified photo viewing application. So it's really good. I'm really happy with the results so far. Okay, that's all I got. Thank you very much for watching. Subscribe, like, comment, all that jazz. All right, see ya.